In the Russian town of Beslan in 2004, terrorists stormed a local school, holding more than 1,100 children, parents and teachers hostage for 3 days. The assault followed in the wake of recent terrorist attacks in Russia by separatist militants, an issue based on ethnic, territorial and religious grounds. It was an issue between adults and had nothing to do with children. But it was the children who were to pay the heaviest price. This event gripped Russia and the world as a particularly cruel, malicious attack. It undermined the most basic of standards and conventions and shook Russian people's confidence in humanity. This was the Russian people's own September 11, creating wounds that would run deep, igniting controversy and suspicion and destroying the soul of a town. Years later, the pain remains raw. Hundreds of people, mainly children, died in the Beslan school siege. The dead and injured were innocent victims, caught in the frenzy of gunfire and the explosions that set the school ablaze. In the hours and days after, the full horror emerged as bodies were gradually retrieved from the burnt-out school building. Many of the victims had burnt to death, trapped by fallen debris. It would be several days before bodies could be identified. Some people were never accounted for. The physical and emotional trauma would be lasting. Children had limbs amputated, eyes removed, and suffered terrible burns and debilitating injuries from bullets and shrapnel. Beslan is a town with its heart ripped out. The siege resulted in the massacre of 186 children, far more than any other terrorist event. Many children lost parents and siblings. Many were permanently disabled. All had their innocence forever taken away. The first day of September is a special date in Russia. It's the first day of the school year, and it's celebrated as the Day of Knowledge. Traditionally, it's a festive occasion, attended by other family members, and on this day, a happy and proud crowd had gathered in the school grounds. Soon after 9 a.m., armed militants stormed the school, forcing almost 1,200 people into the gymnasium. In front of the children, they executed one father for speaking and another for refusing to kneel. The dead were dragged from the room, leaving a trail of blood, visible in the chilling video they released. Authorities swiftly surrounded the school with military and police forces, along with elite government security personnel. 3 apartment buildings overlooking the school were overtaken and snipers put in place. Recently, militant Islamic Chechens had carried out several deadly attacks against Russia, and it was correctly assumed that this was a well-armed Chechen operation. Surprisingly, the Russians set up a security perimeter within range of enemy grenade launchers. Fire services were not in attendance, and few ambulances were made available. The terrorists executed more hostages, the bodies thrown outside. They set explosives and tripwires, and threatened to kill 50 hostages for each of their members killed. The military buildup in the surrounding area continued, and a concentration of heavy artillery and armored vehicles moved into position. But now, military leaders knew the school was mined, and the terrorists had threatened to blow up the building if attacked. Recent Chechen terrorist attacks had ended badly for Russia, with high civilian losses due to heavy-handed military tactics. The government agreed they would not use force and set up for peaceful negotiations. The terrorists made it clear they meant business. A dead man explosive switch was set, hostages a heartbeat away from obliteration. As the day wore on, there was a steady build-up of civilians near the school as word got out and desperate relatives flocked to the area. Already, the media presence had swelled as the shocking news reverberated throughout the international community. The military strengthened its perimeter area, strictly enforcing the no-go zone as families, armed civilians, volunteer militia, and the simply curious amassed on the scene. Onlookers lined the roadsides at the checkpoint, where vehicle entry was tightly controlled, and the area was further fortified with Russian tankers and military vehicles. Conditions for the hostages were horrible. Crushed together in the booby-trapped gymnasium, the heat and anxiety were almost unbearable. The terrorists refused to give them food or water, and many resorted to drinking their own urine. Not everything had gone the terrorists' way, however. During the morning attack at the school, in the chaos and panic, a small number of people had managed to slip out of sight and hide in the school's boiler room. Once military backup arrived and the terrorists had holed up inside the school, it was time to make a move. A few terrified but very lucky people managed to flee from their hiding places and reach safety. A further 50 people also escaped the initial attack and had alerted police. In the ensuing gunfight, one terrorist was killed and 2 injured before the rest gained control of the school. They would not tolerate another loss. Like flies in a spider's web, the hostages were trapped within the explosive wiring, and tormenting them further were the 2 black widows, one of whom took sadistic pleasure in holding her gun to the children's heads. For relatives of the hostages, life had suddenly become hell on earth. They maintained a constant vigil, many sleeping in the entrance of the picture theater, now set up as an information center. Exhausted and sick with worry, they were caught between 2 bad scenarios. The terrorists they knew were capable of committing the worst atrocities. On the other hand, the government had badly botched previous terrorist crises and sacrificed Russian hostages. In the Moscow theater crisis, the Russian army killed 129 hostages with toxic gas. Now, Beslan people begged the government not to storm the school.
Да, один внук пошел в 1 класс, а 2 двойняшки у меня в 4 класс.
Все там?
Все там, да. Дочка повела в школу, а сестра там работает учительницей.
Но в случае неблагоприятного исхода это война. Война здесь, в этом опасном регионе. Война между братскими народами, что допустить невозможно.
A pediatrician, Leonid Roshal, had helped negotiate the release of children in the Moscow theater siege. The Beslan terrorists specifically requested Roshal now as negotiator, specifying that they wanted the children's doctor. He began discussions for a peaceful resolution. As soon as authorities knew about the Beslan siege, they informed President Putin. He immediately broke off his holiday and returned to Moscow, yet for more than a day made no public statement. On day 2 of the siege, while meeting with the visiting King of Jordan, he made a brief statement.
Будем делать все, что от нас зависит, для того, чтобы не допустить подобного развития событий. Но самая главная наша задача заключается, конечно, в том, чтобы в сложившейся ситуации спасти жизнь и здоровье тех, кто оказался в заложниках. Все действия наших сил, которые занимаются освобождением заложников, будут посвящены и подчинены исключительно этой задаче. Прежде всего, решению этой задачи.
Desperate parents had come up with the plan to offer themselves as hostages in exchange for their children. The terrorists refused the offer. They also rejected a shipment of water and medicine for the hostages.
Our children are in there. Can you imagine? Our hearts and souls are there. What would you do if it was your child? What should we do?
Contact with hostage takers is continuing. Unfortunately, we can't yet say we've achieved any progress in these contacts, and unfortunately, there are no results in transferring food to the hostages.
Now, in the second day without food or water, the situation for the hostages was becoming critical, and a grim reality was taking shape in people's minds. The Chechen and Ingush terrorists accepted former Ingush President Ruslan Oshev in for negotiations, and he secured the release of 26 mothers and babies. One mother refused to leave her other children, and Oshev carried her baby out himself. The baby's mother and sister died. Her brother survived. It was now the 3rd day of the siege. Negotiations had been progressing more smoothly, and further talks were planned for the mid-afternoon. The terrorists had finally agreed to allow the bodies of around 20 dead hostages to be removed from the school grounds. Around 1 in the afternoon, 2 ambulances and 4 medical workers arrived to deliver the one dead militant to the school and collect the other corpses. As the medics approached the school, the sound of an explosion was heard in the area of the gymnasium. The terrorists, thinking they were under attack, fired on the medics, killing 2. Less than a minute later, a second strange-sounding explosion was heard, and the roof of the building was quickly on fire. The Russians opened up with a torrent of gunfire, targeting the gymnasium with rocket-propelled grenades, cannon fire, and flamethrowers. Sections of the roof caved in, falling on top of the already weak hostages and trapping them till the flames consumed them. Around 160 hostages died this way. Others managed to escape and head for safety. Several didn't make it, caught in the stream of gunfire, much of it so-called friendly fire. The Russians later claimed that militants shot hostages as they run, but many bullets had entered from the front and not behind. Witnesses testified that the Russian gunfire had been particularly fierce, and the second strange-sounding explosion was found to have originated from outside the building, not within. This is what was responsible for the inferno and the subsequent deaths in the gymnasium. As the victims emerged from the destruction, there were too few ambulances to deal with the scale of the disaster. Some were badly injured, some had made miraculous escapes, but all were severely traumatized. Residents pulled together, ferrying the injured in private cars to the only hospital in town. Beslan's hospital was hopelessly overwhelmed, with insufficient beds, equipment and medicines. Eventually, the worst cases would be transported elsewhere, but for some, eventually was too late. and for anyone still in the gymnasium, there was no hope now.
At the very end, it was hell. Everything was exploding. The terrorists were shooting everyone. There were bullets everywhere.
Surprisingly, firefighters were not initially called out to the gymnasium. 2 hours after the fire, one crew went out of their own accord, but were unable to get adequate water for quite some time. By this stage, the fire had taken hold and was almost impossible to control. A second truck was sent out, arriving soon after the first. All that could be done now was begin the mop-up process. Officially, the death toll was 334, which included 156 children. A further 200 people were either missing or unidentified. Of the dead, 200 had burns. And based on scorch marks on surfaces, it was ascertained that 100 had burned alive. The burnt walls also revealed the terrorists had stashed their weapons here when the gym was built months ago. The children, disfigured by burns and shrapnel, faced a long haul. Some would never return to normal, tissue damaged beyond repair. They would need skin grafts, but not be able to afford it, and they would be forgotten by the government and the public, so that they would only lead a half-life. Many of Beslan's innocents would be punished for the rest of their lives. Some months after the Beslan siege, Chechen guerrilla commander Shamil Basiev claimed responsibility. The attack had certainly involved both Chechen and Ingush terrorists, but also included several militant Islamists from various nations. Basiev had previously been linked to other similar terrorist attacks, and he was roundly condemned from most quarters, even those normally sympathetic to his style. In the wake of the horrified reaction to Beslan, Chechen terrorist attacks ceased for a few years. 2 years after Basiev laid claim to Beslan, he was himself killed in an explosion. A few days after the siege ended, the first of the funerals was held. Not a single townsperson escaped grief. Everybody had lost someone: relatives, friends, workmates, neighbors. The funerals were conducted in quick succession, townspeople moving from one funeral to the next, and even with mass burials of 120. So great was the scale of people's loss that Beslan Cemetery could not accommodate all the burials. A whole new area was established, the City of Angels. Most of the burials here were the children of the siege. Every second headstone carries a toy or sweets for the child. The town suffers the burden of a collective grief. A distant wail of anguish breeds a tear or a sob, renewing another's misery. Such a depth of sadness will probably never allow Beslan's people to live normal, happy lives. The siege, a permanent shadow on the town. In response to the attack, President Putin introduced tough anti-terrorism laws and expanded the powers of law enforcement agencies. In doing so, he was transferring power even further from the people to the central government. Putin himself had been elected before Beslan on the basis of cracking down on Chechen militants. Given that the Beslan terrorists had quite simply waltzed through the government's security points, it's questionable what this will achieve. Although the aftermath of Beslan saw a dramatic drop in Chechen and Ingush extremism, still the tensions remain high. In 2010, the peace was fractured once again with attacks on Russian train stations by female suicide bombers. The divisions go a long way back, and all sides play some part in the backstory. The town of Beslan and the school itself had featured in ethnic attacks and atrocities. This was a factor influencing some of the terrorists who had themselves lost family members due to ethnic cleansing. Revenge, unfortunately, is a circle. It just keeps going round and round. A deep unhappiness and anger rose up in Beslan following the siege. With justification, people felt the government had let them down and the facts had been manipulated. Organizations formed soon after the tragedy, including Mothers of Beslan, making enough of a stir to receive an audience with President Putin.
Не в состоянии обеспечить сегодня в необходимом объеме и в необходимом качестве безопасность своих граждан. К сожалению, это относится не только к нашему государству. Вы знаете о ужасной трагедии, которая произошла в Соединенных Штатах в 2001 году, когда и правоохранители, и специальные службы проворонили и пропустили ужасный террористический акт, в результате которого погибли тысячи людей. Тысячи людей погибли. Вы знаете о террористических актах в Испании, о недавнем теракте в Лондоне, Великобритании. Развитые мощные государства с функционирующей экономикой и с отлаженными специальными службами не могут противостоять сегодня. Что же говорить о нашей стране, которая после распада Советского Союза понесла огромный ущерб по всем направлениям. И в области социальной политики, и в экономике. В первой половине 90-х годов в результате тяжелых событий в Чечне наши и вооруженные силы, и специальные службы вообще находились в состоянии нокаута, в полуразложенном состоянии. К сожалению, никакого другого способа, кроме того, чтобы бороться с этой заразой, с терроризмом, у нас нет. Вместе с тем, хочу это подчеркнуть особо и отметить, согласен с теми, кто считает, что это не может быть оправданием для ненадлежащего исполнения должностными лицами своих служебных обязанностей. Это правда. И это должно быть все обстоятельства этого дела должны быть расследованы тщательно. Вы и вся общественность России должны быть с этим ознакомлены.
At least 334 people, maybe as many as 500, lost their lives in Beslan. Countless remain injured and traumatized, more than half of these children. There are so many question marks, so many what-ifs. That is the eternal question that won't allow the bereaved to rest. Hopefully, those they mourn do now at least rest in peace.